The photograph was taken just after midnight, when Christmas had technically ended, but no one there was ready to let it go. For people stand shoulder to shoulder beneath the glow of the Las Vegas Strip, their faces lit not by candlelight or fireplaces, but by towering neon signs that never sleep. Red, blue, gold. Colors bleeding into one another, blurring the edges of their smiles. It's the kind of photo people take without thinking twice, the kind that gets buried in a camera roll and rediscovered years later with a soft laugh and a quiet, "I forgot about this night." In the image, everything looks right. Scarves hang loosely around their necks. Festive but unnecessary in the desert cold. One of them is mid-laugh, mouth open, eyes squeezed shut, caught in a moment so alive it almost feels loud. Another leans slightly inward, as if the gravity of the group itself is pulling them together. Behind them, the strip stretches endlessly, alive with movement. Cars sliding past, crowds drifting, lights pulsing like a synthetic heartbeat. It is Christmas in Las Vegas, a city that sells joy with absolute confidence. What the photograph doesn't show is how carefully that joy is staged. It doesn't show the exhaustion behind the smiles, the unspoken tensions carried across state lines, the quiet hope each of them brought with them. Hope that this trip might fix something, or at least soften the ache of what had already begun to crack. At the time, this was just a picture, a memory, proof that they had been happy, or at least happy enough to pretend. Years later, it would become something else entirely. Las Vegas has a way of doing that to moments. It freezes them in artificial light, preserving them without context, without consequence. You can walk its streets at midnight on Christmas Day and feel nothing but celebration. Music spilling from open doors, strangers hugging, glasses clinking, laughter echoing off polished stone. It's a place where time feels suspended, where tomorrow doesn't matter and yesterday barely exists. That's why they chose it. For some people, Christmas is about returning home. For others, it's about escaping it. They arrive separately but close enough together to feel like a single unit, pulling suitcases through hotel lobbies that smell faintly of perfume and recycled air. The decorations were extravagant in the way only Vegas can manage. Towering trees made of glass ornaments, fake snow drifting beneath chandeliers, holiday music remixed into something louder, faster, less gentle than it was ever meant to be. It was festive without being intimate, cheerful without being warm. Perfect for people who didn't want to think too deeply about what the holidays had begun to mean. They had planned this trip months earlier, back when Christmas still felt far away, when it was easier to imagine that stepping into a different city might allow them to step out of their own lives for a while. A long weekend. No obligations. No expectations. Just lights, drinks, and the promise that whatever they were running from wouldn't follow them here. In the photograph, you can almost believe it worked. Their bodies are relaxed. Their shoulders aren't tense yet. No one is looking over their shoulder. No one is checking their phone. For that fraction of a second, they exist only in the present. For people suspended between past and future, unaware that this moment will soon be asked to carry more weight than it ever should. If you stare at the image long enough, small details begin to feel louder. The way one person's smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. The way another stands just a half step apart. Close, but not fully aligned. The way the background lights seem too bright, almost overwhelming, as if the city itself is pressing forward, insisting on being seen. At the time, none of that mattered. They had just finished dinner. Too much food, too many drinks, the kind of indulgence that feels justified on Christmas. They talked about nothing important. Work complaints, old stories, jokes they'd told each other a dozen times before. The night was still young, and Vegas encouraged that illusion, whispering that it could stretch on forever if they wanted it to. Someone suggested a photo. It was an offhand idea, tossed into the air without ceremony. A passerby was handed a phone. Everyone leaned in. The shutter clicked. That was it. No one knew they were documenting the last complete version of themselves. No one knew that this image would eventually be studied not for what it showed, but for what came immediately after. That strangers would analyze the smiles, pause on the body language, wonder the truth had been hiding there all along. Photographs are cruel that way. They promise certainty, but deliver only silence. Vegas continued to move around them, indifferent and electric. Somewhere nearby, slot machines rang out in endless cycles of hope and loss. Somewhere above them, hotel rooms stacked floor upon floor, identical and anonymous, held stories no one would ever ask about. The Strip doesn't remember faces. It remembers money, movement, noise. When they walked away from the spot where the photo was taken, the city swallowed them instantly. The crowd closed. The lights shifted. Another group stepped into the same space, laughing just as loudly, believing just as confidently that this night belonged to them. And maybe, for a few hours, it did. But photographs don't lie. They just wait. Years later, when the image resurfaced, it wouldn't feel festive anymore. The lights would look harsher. The smiles would feel fragile. The joy would seem almost reckless in hindsight, like laughter echoing down a hallway that ends abruptly in darkness. That Christmas night in Vegas would stop being remembered as a celebration. It would become the last clear point before everything disappeared. It doesn't care what you left behind, or what version of yourself you're trying to outrun. From the moment you arrive, it offers anonymity as a luxury. No history required, no future expected. You can walk through its doors carrying grief, debt, regret, or quiet desperation, and the city will greet you the same way it greets everyone else, with lights bright enough to wash everything clean. That is the lie at the heart of it. Vegas is built to forget, but it never truly lets anything go. Beneath the polished floors and mirrored ceilings, the city is layered with remnants of what came before. Casinos imploded to make room for newer ones. Hotels renamed, remodeled, rebranded, until even the locals forget what used to stand where. Entire decades of race and controlled explosions that draw crowds, applause, and countdowns. Destruction turned into entertainment. Nothing here is meant to last. That's the point. For the four of them, this was part of the appeal. Christmas elsewhere came with expectations. Family tables, old arguments, traditions that felt heavier each year. Vegas offered something cleaner, something unburdened. No childhood memories attached to these streets. No emotional inheritance. Just a temporary life rented by the night. The city welcomed them with open arms and closed eyes. They checked into a hotel that looked like dozens of others. Cavernous lobby, artificial scent pumped through the air, carpet designed to disorient rather than guide. The front desk clerk smiled without curiosity. Names were exchanged, keys were handed over, and just like that, they were reduced to room numbers and checkout times. In Las Vegas, that is freedom. From their windows, the Strip looked endless, a river of light cutting to the desert, defiant and unnatural. It was easy to believe that nothing bad could happen here, not because the city was safe, but because it felt unreal, as if consequences belonged to another place entirely. They spent the first day drifting. No rigid plans, no schedule. That was another unspoken agreement of the trip. To let the city decide where they went next. A casino here, a bar there, wandering through crowds thick with tourists and locals who had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Everywhere they went, the same sounds followed them. Bells, cheers, music layered on music. It created a kind of emotional white noise, a constant hum that made it hard to think too deeply or feel too sharply. That was intentional. Vegas doesn't want reflection. It wants distraction. As night fell, the city grew louder, brighter, more insistent. Christmas decorations glowed against the darkness, exaggerated and oversized, as if subtlety had no place here. Fake snow drifted inside climate-controlled spaces. Holiday songs played on endless loops, stripped of their softness and repackaged as spectacle. It was celebration without reflection, joy without intimacy. For a while, that was enough. But even in a city designed to erase context, personal histories have a way of leaking through. In quiet moments, waiting for an elevator, standing in line for drinks, sitting at a table where conversation briefly stalled, pieces of the real world crept back in. A glance held too long, a sigh released too sharply, a phone checked and then quickly put away. No one spoke about it directly, but each of them had arrived carrying something unresolved. The city didn't remove those burdens. It simply gave them somewhere to set them down temporarily, like coats left unattended in a crowded room. The danger was never that Vegas would take something from them. The danger was that it would make them forget to watch what they were leaving behind. Late at night, when the Strip was at its most alive, it also felt strangely hollow. Thousands of people moved past one another without friction, without acknowledgement. You could scream and be absorbed by the noise. You could vanish between crowds, and no one would notice the moment you were gone. This wasn't paranoia. It was design. The buildings were massive, labyrinthine, intentionally confusing. Corridors bent and split. Elevators led to places that felt disconnected from the rest of the world. Staff changed shifts, guests rotated in and out, and faces blurred together into a single, forgettable mass. It was easy to imagine how someone could slip through the cracks here. Still, that thought never fully formed. Not yet. At this stage, Vegas was still just a backdrop, glittering, indulgent, alive. The kind of place where you believe stories only happen to other people, where danger feels theoretical, distant, diluted by the promise of constant entertainment. The city lulled them into that belief with precision. By the time Christmas night arrived, they felt untethered, looser, less guarded. The city had done what always does best. It had convinced them they were anonymous, that nothing about them mattered enough to leave a mark. That anonymity would later become the most unsettling part of all, because when something finally did go wrong, there would be no neighborhood to notice, no routine to break, no familiar faces to say, something feels off, just a city that had been built, from the ground up, to keep moving no matter who fell behind. And in Las Vegas, the lights never dimmed long enough to reveal what's missing, before the city blurred them together. Before the Strip reduced them to silhouettes moving through light, there were 4 separate lives arriving at the same place for very different reasons. They did not all board the plane with the same expectations. They did not carry the same kind of hope. What bound them wasn't similarity, it was timing, a convergence of quiet fractures that made escape feel necessary, even urgent. One of them had been the organizer, the one who suggested Vegas in the first place, months earlier, during a conversation that began as a joke and slowly hardened into a plan. On the surface, they were the most stable of the group, the reliable one, the person who always answered messages, who remembered birthdays, who appeared to have their life neatly aligned. But stability can be deceptive. Beneath it, something had been unraveling quietly, a sense that life had settled into a shape they never consciously chose. The trip wasn't about celebration. It was about disruption, about feeling something unscripted again. Another arrived carrying grief, so fresh it still felt unreal. A recent loss that no one quite knew how to talk about anymore. At home, Christmas had become unbearable. Empty chairs, forced smiles, conversations that circle around what was missing without ever naming it. Vegas, with its relentless noise and refusal to pause, promised relief. Here, grief might dissolve into motion, or at least be drowned out long enough to breathe. The third had come for different reasons entirely. Financial stress clung to them like a second skin, though they hid it well. Bills unanswered, a job that looked fine from the outside, but felt increasingly unstable. They smiled easily, joked often, played the role expected of them. This trip was a gamble in more ways than one, a belief that stepping into excess might temporarily cancel out scarcity, that if they acted carefree enough, reality would follow. And then there was the one who spoke the least about themselves, the quiet observer, the one who listened more than they shared. They had agreed to the trip almost too quickly, as if they were waiting for an excuse to leave town without explaining why. No one pressed them. In this group, silence had always been respected. But silence, like darkness, can conceal more than it reveals. Together, they made sense. Years of shared history smoothed over the differences. Old friendships have a way of doing that, turning complexity into shorthand, assuming familiarity equals understanding. They believed they knew one another well enough to predict reactions, to read moods, to notice if something was wrong. That belief would later feel naive. The first night passed easily. Dinner stretched longer than planned. Drinks arrived faster than expected. Conversation flowed the way it always had, skipping between past and present, revisiting stories that grew less accurate with each retelling. They laughed about who they used to be, about choices that now felt distant and strangely impersonal. But beneath the laughter, Each of them was listening for something else, a reassurance, a distraction, a sign that coming here had been the right decision. As the night wore on, the city began to work its subtle magic. The clatter of slot machines, the low hum of voices overlapping in every direction, the sense that no one was watching closely enough to care what you did next. It loosened them, softened edges that had grown rigid back home. That was when small cracks began to show. A joke landed wrong and lingered too long. A comment about the future went unanswered. Someone drank more than they usually did. Someone else grew uncharacteristically quiet. None of it was dramatic. None of it felt important enough to address. These were old friends. After all, tension was familiar, manageable, or so they thought. The next day unfolded in fragments. Shopping, wandering, hours lost without explanation. Vegas is designed to make time feel optional, and they surrendered to that willingly. They moved together, but not always in sync, drifting apart and rejoining, sometimes unaware of how long someone had been gone. That ease, that trust, was part of the danger. In another city, someone disappearing for a few hours might raise questions. Here, it barely registered. Everyone was doing their own version of escape. Everyone assumed the others were fine. By the time Christmas night arrived, they were operating on momentum rather than intention. The city had set the pace, and they followed without resistance. Their earlier reservations had been replaced by a sense of inevitability. Wherever the night went, they would go with it. It was during this stretch of time that the emotional fault lines deepened. The organizer felt an unexpected hollowing, a realization that even here, even now, the restlessness hadn't gone away. The one carrying grief felt a sudden, sharp wave of guilt for enjoying themselves at all. The one under financial strain felt a familiar anxiety resurface with each swipe of a card. And the quiet one, whose inner world remained largely unspoken, felt something else entirely, a sense of being unmoored, of standing at the edge of decision that no one else could see. They were still together, still smiling, still functioning as a group, but they were no longer aligned. That misalignment was subtle, almost imperceptible. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, widening the emotional distance between them one unremarkable moment at a time. When they took the photograph later that night, none of this was visible. The camera flattened complexity into a single, frozen expression of unity. It erased hesitation. It concealed doubt. It captured them as they want to be remembered, not as they truly were. In reality, each of them was already beginning to drift, pulled by private thoughts, unspoken fears, and desires they hadn't yet admitted to themselves. Vegas didn't cause that drift. It merely provided the space for it to happen unnoticed. There is no gradual quiet, no gentle winding down. The city refuses closure. Midnight passes unnoticed, swallowed by music and motion, as if time itself has been bribed to look the other way. For the four of them, the night stretched longer than it should have, unfolding in fragments that later refuse to line up cleanly in memory. They moved from place to place without marking the transitions. A bar blurred into a casino floor. A crowded sidewalk dissolved into an elevator ride they would struggle to remember clearly. Drinks arrived, were emptied, replaced. The artificial night pressed in from all sides, bright enough to make exhaustion feel optional. At some point, the group thinned without anyone consciously deciding to separate. It didn't happen all at once. One person stopped to check their phone. Another drifted ahead, drawn by sound or light or the promise of something new. The space in between them widened just enough to feel normal in a crowd this large. No alarms went off. No one counted heads. In Vegas, losing sight of someone for a few minutes is expected. The quiet one lagged behind. Not dramatically, not enough to call attention to it. Just enough to create a small pocket of distance that closed and reopened unpredictably. The others assumed they were right there, just out of frame. They always had been before. There was an argument, small, almost forgettable in the moment. Words exchanged too quickly, fueled by fatigue and alcohol, the kind of disagreement that would usually burn out within minutes. No one remembers exactly what it was about. That uncertainty would later become unbearable. What mattered wasn't the content of the argument, but its timing. Someone walked away to cool off. Someone else stayed behind, convinced it was temporary. The city absorbed the separation without resistance, folding it neatly into the endless flow of bodies moving in every direction. The lights overhead made it hard to read faces. Everyone looked illuminated, flattened, slightly unreal. Voices overlapped. Music pulsed through walls and floors. It was impossible to tell who belonged to whom. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. When the group reassembled, it was incomplete, but not obviously so. One person assumed the missing presence was just ahead. Another assumed they had gone back to the hotel. These assumptions were made silently, without discussion, because none of them felt urgent enough to challenge. That is how the night kept going. They continued on autopilot, following the path of least resistance, letting the city carry them forward. Every now and then, someone would glance behind them, feel a brief flicker of uncertainty, and then dismiss it. In a place this crowded, doubt felt unnecessary. By the time they realized someone was truly gone, the idea of retracing their steps felt overwhelming. The night had already splintered into too many directions. Where would they even start? They checked phones. Messages were sent, then sent again. Calls went unanswered. Each attempt chipped away at the illusion that this was still normal, still manageable. But Vegas is a city that makes concern feel premature. Surely they were fine. Surely they'd turn up at the hotel, laughing about a misconnection, annoyed but unharmed. That belief lasted longer than it should have. Back in the hotel room, the silence felt heavier than expected. The artificial calm, the thick curtains, the muted hum of air conditioning stood in stark contrast to the chaos outside. It should have been a place of relief. Instead, it amplified the absence. They argued quietly now, frustration replacing earlier laughter. Who last saw them? What time was it? Did anyone actually hear what they said before walking away? The details refused to settle into a coherent sequence. That night did not end with certainty. It ended with exhaustion. Eventually, they fell asleep in shifts, phones nearby, volume turned up. Every vibration triggered hope, then disappointment. The city outside kept celebrating, oblivious to the fracture that had already taken place. Morning arrived without answers. Christmas decorations still glowed. Tourists still moved through the lobby with fresh energy, carrying shopping bags and coffee cups, unaware that a quiet panic was unfolding just beneath the surface. At first, the response was restrained. Rational. Adults go missing all the time in Vegas, at least temporarily. Someone oversleeps. Someone checks out early. Someone makes a spontaneous decision and forgets to explain. But as hours passed, restraint gave way to fear. Hotel staff were polite but detached. Security footage was discussed in vague terms. The assumption, unspoken but clear, was that this was not unusual enough to warrant alarm. Not yet. The city had already begun to reframe the night as forgettable. For the three who remained, Christmas night stopped being a celebration and became something else entirely. A blur of half-remembered moments and unanswered questions. They replayed conversations in their minds, searching for warning signs that might not have existed. The realization settled in slowly, like a weight pressing down on the chest. Christmas night hadn't ended. It had simply stopped making sense. And somewhere in the endless corridors and crowds of Las Vegas, the space where one of them should have been remained empty, unnoticed by everyone except the people who knew to look for it. At first, they had treated the absence like a delay, a misunderstanding that could still be corrected with the right phone call, the right explanation. People don't just vanish. Not really. Not without noise. Not without leaving something behind. That belief clung to them even as hours continued to slip away without contact. They retraced what they could. The hotel lobby. The stretch of sidewalk where they'd last been together. The casino floor where voices and lights overlapped into a sensory blur. Each location felt smaller in daylight, stripped of the energy that had made the night feel endless. What remained was confusion. No clear starting point. No witnesses who remembered anything specific enough to help. When they finally contacted the police, the response was measured to the point of indifference. An adult. No signs of violence. A city where people routinely leave without notice. The questions came slowly, mechanically. Was there a history of mental health issues? Substance use? Relationship problems? The implications were clear. Disappearance could be voluntary. In Las Vegas, that possibility always hovers in the background, ready to explain away uncertainty. A report was taken, but it felt procedural rather than urgent. A box checked, a form filed. The city did not pause. For the three who remained, time fractured. Every hour stretched too long, while days blurred together without distinction. They extended their stay, convinced that leaving would feel like abandonment. Sleep became shallow. Food tasted like nothing. Every unfamiliar face sparked a jolt of hope that collapsed just as quickly. They began to notice how invisible they were. In a smaller town, a missing person becomes communal. Posters go up. Conversations shift. Someone always knows someone who saw something. In Las Vegas, anonymity is a default state. Millions pass through and disappear again, leaving no impression. A missing adult barely registers against that scale. The story did not make headlines. There were no press conferences, no public appeals, no camera crews gathering outside the hotel. The absence did not meet the threshold for spectacle, and without spectacle, it struggled to exist at all. This lack of attention hurt almost as much as the disappearance itself. Friends and family back home called, their voices tight with concern, asking for details the three could not provide. What were they wearing? Who were they with? When exactly was the last confirmed sighting? Each question forced them to confront how little they truly knew. Memory betrayed them. Details shifted each time they were recalled. Times blurred. Locations overlapped. The night resisted reconstruction, as if it had been designed to defy clarity. Every inconsistency fed guilt. If they couldn't even agree on what happened, how could anyone else take it seriously? As days passed, the police follow-ups grew less frequent. Leads dried up almost as soon as they were mentioned. Security footage was limited, fragmented, overwritten by newer recordings. The city moved too fast to preserve the past for long. Eventually, they had to leave. Returning home felt wrong, but staying no longer felt productive. Vegas had made it clear that whatever answers existed would not be easily offered. The three packed their bags in silence, the weight of what they were leaving behind pressing against every movement. The flight home was unbearable. Every announcement over the intercom sounded distant, distorted. Passengers around them talked about holiday plans, about families waiting at the airport, about the comfort of returning to something familiar. None of that applied anymore. Back home, life continued with a cruelty that felt personal. Christmas decorations were still up. Music still played in stores. People still asked casually, "How was your trip?" The question became unbearable, impossible to answer without unraveling. In the weeks that followed, the disappearance began to fade from public awareness entirely. The case remained technically open, but activity slowed to a crawl. No suspects, no evidence, no clear direction. What lingered instead was suspicion, not from authorities, but from within the group itself. They replayed the night obsessively, questioning not just events, but each other. Why did you walk ahead? Why didn't you call sooner? Why didn't you insist on finding them immediately? These questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they hummed between them, heavy and corrosive. Their shared history began to fracture under the strain. Each of them processed the loss differently. One became consumed by guilt, convinced that a single different decision could have changed everything. Another grew defensive, clinging to belief that there was nothing they could have done. The third withdrew entirely, unable to bear the constant replay of a night that no longer felt real. Over time, their contact diminished. Messages went unanswered. Calls became infrequent. The disappearance that had bound them together now drove them apart, each carrying their own version of the story, each convinced they were the one who remembered it most accurately. The missing person became a ghost, not just absent, but undefined. Without answers, imagination filled the gaps. Every headline about crime in Vegas sparked dread. Every rumor felt plausible. Every year that passed without resolution made hope feel more irresponsible. The city had succeeded in what it does best. It had absorbed the disappearance without disruption. And somewhere in the vast machinery of hotels, hallways, and forgotten spaces, the truth, whatever it was, remained buried unnoticed and waiting. In the months after disappearance, life resumed in ways that felt both inevitable and deeply wrong. Bills still arrived. Jobs still demanded attention. Friends still celebrated milestones. The world moved forward with a confidence that felt almost insulting, as if nothing essential had been disrupted. For the three who remained, survival became an act of compartmentalization. At first, the absence was sharp, ever-present. Every unfamiliar number triggered a rush of adrenaline. Every news alert felt like it might finally contain the answer. They learned to live in a state of constant readiness, bracing themselves for a call that never came. Eventually, that vigilance became exhausting. Hope did not disappear all at once. It eroded gradually, worn down by repetition and disappointment. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and the disappearance settled into something quieter but no less heavy, a background ache that never fully went away. Each of them tried, in their own way, to construct a future around that absence. One threw themselves into work, taking on extra responsibilities, longer hours, anything that kept their mind occupied. On the surface, it looked like progress. Promotions followed. Stability returned. But beneath it all was a sense of running in place, of motion without movement. Every achievement felt provisional, shadowed by the question of whether it was earned or simply used as distraction. Another sought comfort in relationships, chasing connection with an urgency that bordered on desperation. They needed to feel anchored, needed proof that people could still stay, that disappearance was not inevitable. Some relationships burned brightly and quickly. Others faded without explanation. Each ending reopened the same wound, reinforcing the fear that nothing was permanent. The third took a different approach. They distanced themselves from everything that reminded them of Vegas. Old photos were archived, not deleted but carefully hidden. Conversations about the trip were redirected or shut down entirely. It was a form of self-preservation, an attempt to freeze the past so it couldn't intrude on the present. But memory does not respond well to being ignored. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. Holidays became complicated. Christmas, especially, transformed from a season of anticipation into something tense and fragile. Decorations felt excessive. Music felt intrusive. Every year, the same unspoken thoughts surfaced. This is a time when it happened. Even as the world forgot, the calendar never did. Occasionally, the case resurfaced. A new detective reviewing old files. A tip that led nowhere. A brief flicker of attention that raised hope just long enough to make its disappearance hurt again. Each time, they braced themselves, only to be reminded how little had changed. The missing person remained officially missing. No remains. No confirmation. No story with beginning, middle, and end. That ambiguity was its own kind of prison. Without closure, grief had nowhere to go. There was no funeral to attend, no ritual to mark the transition from presence to memory. The loss existed in a permanent state of suspension, neither fully acknowledged nor fully resolved. Over time, guilt mutated. It became less about specific decisions and more about survival itself. Was it wrong to move on? To laugh? To plan for a future that one of them never got to have? These questions surface in quiet moments, uninvited and relentless. The city of Las Vegas receded into the background of their lives, mentioned only when necessary. It became shorthand for something unspeakable, a place name that carried more weight than geography alone ever should. They stopped checking for updates, not because they no longer cared, but because caring had become unsustainable. Years passed. The world changed. Technology advanced. New scandals replaced old ones. The disappearance became increasingly difficult to contextualize, a relic of a past moment that no longer fit neatly into current narratives. But the absence remained remarkably intact. Then, without warning, it resurfaced, not through a phone call or an email or a carefully worded update from law enforcement, but through news of a building, one none of them had thought about in years. A forgotten structure off the strip, scheduled for demolition. The kind of announcement that usually passes unnoticed, buried beneath headlines about new resorts and expansions. But this one carried a strange, inexplicable pull. When the first message arrived, short, cautious, almost disbelieving, it took time to register. Something had been found. The details were vague, preliminary, unconfirmed, but enough to stir something long dormant, enough to reopen doors they had spent years trying to keep closed. In that moment, the past collapsed into the present. The carefully constructed distance between who they were now and who they had been that Christmas night evaporated. Old emotions surged back with startling clarity. Fear, guilt, hope, dread, all colliding at once. The city they had worked so hard to forget was calling them back. And this time, it was not offering distraction. It was offering answers, whether they were ready to face them or not. It sat just far enough in the strip to be overlooked, tucked behind newer developments that rose taller, brighter, louder. At one point, decades earlier, it had been marketed as an extension, an auxiliary space meant to catch overflow traffic during peak seasons. Then it became something else. Then nothing at all. Ownership changed. Signage disappeared. Windows were boarded, then unboarded, then boarded again. Eventually, it slipped out of the city's active memory entirely. Las Vegas is full of places like this. Structures that once mattered briefly before being swallowed by progress. They don't get farewell ceremonies or nostalgic retrospectives. They wait quietly for demolition notices, their existence reduced to a line item on a redevelopment plan. When the building was scheduled to come down, no one protested. It wasn't historic enough to preserve. It wasn't profitable enough to renovate. It didn't even have a recognizable name anymore. To the city, it was dead space, an inconvenience between what had been and what was coming next. The demolition crew arrived early in the morning, expecting nothing more than dust and rot. Their work followed a familiar rhythm. Secure the perimeter, assess structural integrity, identify hazards. It was procedural, efficient, stripped of curiosity. Buildings like this rarely offered surprises. Inside, the air was stale, thick with disuse. The power had been cut years earlier. Natural light filtered in through cracks and broken fixtures, illuminating layers of decay. Peeling paint, warped flooring, abandoned furniture left without ceremony. Evidence of human presence lingered in the most impersonal ways. Graffiti scrawled by trespassers. Empty bottles. Old wrappers. Nothing unusual. As they moved deeper into the structure, the layout grew stranger. Corridors narrowed unexpectedly. Doors led to rooms that served no obvious purpose. Some spaces felt deliberately disconnected, as if they had been added later, without regard for cohesion or design logic. That wasn't uncommon either. Older Vegas buildings are full of improvisation, renovations stacked on renovations, shortcuts taken to save time or money. Blueprints rarely tell the whole story. It wasn't until they reached a section that didn't appear on any of the plans that things began to shift. At first, it was just a wall, unremarkable in appearance, except for how new it seemed compared to its surroundings. The concrete was smoother, less weathered, the seams cleaner. It stood out not because it was obvious, but because it didn't quite belong. One of the workers assumed it concealed an old utility space, a sealed-off storage room, maybe. These discoveries happened occasionally, especially in buildings that had changed hands repeatedly. They marked it for removal. When the machinery broke through the surface, the sound changed. That was the first sign something was wrong. The impact didn't echo the way it should have. The resistance felt uneven, hollow in places where it should have been solid. The worker paused, instinct overriding routine. They switched to manual tools, clearing debris more carefully. Behind the wall was another wall, and behind that, a door. The door wasn't decorative. It wasn't accidental. It was heavy, reinforced, built with intention. No signage, no handle on the outside. Just a flat surface interrupted by a narrow viewing slot, its cover sealed shut. The room beyond was small, windowless, sound dampened. What struck them first wasn't what was inside. It was what wasn't. No dust coating every surface. No evidence of long-term abandonment. The space had been closed off, not forgotten, preserved in darkness. The workers backed away, unsure what they were looking at. Training kicked in. Work stopped. Authorities were contacted. As word spread, the site shifted from construction zone to control perimeter. Yellow tape replaced caution cones. The hum of machinery gave way to silence. Inside, investigators moved slowly. They noted the thickness of the walls, the reinforced materials, the absence of decoration, the way the room seemed designed not for comfort, but for containment, for isolation. There were markings, not dramatic, not theatrical, just enough to suggest prolonged human presence. Scratches at eye level, indentations along the floor, signs of repeated contact in the same places, over and over again. It didn't take long for the word cell to surface. Not officially, not yet, but quietly among those trained to recognize spaces built for confinement. This wasn't a panic room. It wasn't a vault. It wasn't a storage area repurposed by chance. It was intentional, and it had been hidden. The location raised immediate questions. How long had it been there? Who built it? Who knew? Permits were reviewed. Renovation records examined. Ownership histories traced back through a maze of shell companies and short-lived enterprises. The answers refused to settle. Some records were missing. Others were incomplete. Certain renovations were vaguely documented, described in language that revealed nothing of substance. In a city where construction happens constantly, oversight gaps are not unusual. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. As investigators worked, a familiar pattern emerged, one that anyone who understands Las Vegas recognizes instinctively. Responsibility diffused. Accountability blurred. Each entity pointed elsewhere. The building had changed hands too many times. The past had been erased too efficiently. And yet, the room remained, preserved like a secret that had simply been waiting. When the discovery reached the media, it spread cautiously at first. No sensational headlines. No breathless speculation. Just carefully worded reports about an undocumented confined space found during demolition. But people read between the lines. The city has a long memory for scandal, even when it pretends otherwise. Whispers began. Comparisons were drawn. Old cases resurfaced in online forums. Names mentioned tentatively, as if speaking them too loudly might make them disappear again. Investigators cross-referenced missing persons reports, not just recent ones, but cases that had stalled years earlier, adults who vanished without evidence. Stories dismissed as voluntary disappearances, mental health crises, or unfortunate consequences of excess. Patterns emerged, not conclusions, not proof, but enough alignment to raise unease. For the first time in years, the disappearance from that Christmas night in Vegas returned to official conversation, not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, but as a possibility. When the surviving three were contacted, the language was careful, non-committal. Authorities had learned not to promise answers too early. They explained discovery in neutral terms, avoiding speculation. But the implication was impossible to miss. A hidden cell, a building off the strip, a city that loses people quietly. The past they had worked so hard to compartmentalize surged forward with force. Every suppressed memory resurfaced, sharpened before. The night, the argument, the moment they realized someone was missing and chose, for just a little too long, to believe everything was fine. The building they had never known existed suddenly felt intimately familiar, because it belonged to the same city that had taken someone from them without explanation, the same city that had taught them how easy it was for absence to become normal. Now, as investigators stood inside that sealed room, documenting every detail, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a forgotten space. It was a reminder that in Las Vegas, things don't disappear because they are insignificant. They disappear because the city is designed to let them. Developer mode section 8KO expand Caro English mile without heading or word count 1400 plus host section number mentioned Krna he start ma. Even after it had been documented, measured, photographed from every permissible angle, it remained difficult to describe without reducing it to something smaller than it was. Words like cell or chamber suggested purpose, familiarity, structures people thought they understood. But standing inside it, investigators felt the inadequacy of those terms immediately. This was not a place meant to be recognized. The walls were thick, layered with materials chosen less for strength than for silence. Sound did not behave normally inside the space. Voices seemed to flatten, stripped of echo, absorbed before they could fully form. It was a kind of quiet that felt active rather than empty, as if the room itself was listening. There were no windows, no vents large enough to suggest airflow beyond the bare minimum required to keep someone alive. The lighting, installed at some point, though no one could yet determine when, was harsh and utilitarian, positioned to illuminate everything without offering comfort. Nothing here invited rest. Nothing softened the edges. The door told its own story. Reinforced steel, mounted with precision. The locking mechanism was internal and external, designed to secure the room from both sides. There were no emergency releases, no signage, no indication that this space had ever been intended for anything other than control. Investigators moved slowly, methodically, aware that interpretation mattered as much as evidence. This was not a crime scene frozen in time. It was something stranger, a place that had been erased deliberately, sealed away before decay could distort its meaning. There were marks, not dramatic enough to shock at first glance, not theatrical, but unmistakable once noticed. Repeated abrasions at shoulder height, faint grooves worn into the floor near one corner, subtle discoloration along the wall where skin had come into contact again and again. These were not accidents. They spoke of routine, of time spent in confinement, long enough for the body to leave an imprint. There was no furniture in the traditional sense. No bed, no chair, only fixtures built directly into the structure, elements that could not be removed, only endured. A drain in the floor, a narrow shelf recessed into the wall. Features that suggested planning rather than improvisation. This wasn't a panic room created in fear. It was a space designed to hold someone indefinitely. The absence of certain things was just as telling. No personal items left behind. No clothing. No objects that could easily be traced. Whoever sealed the room understood what not to leave behind as clearly as they understood what to build. That restraint made the discovery more unsettling, not less, because it suggested experience. As the investigation deepened, experts were brought in, people who specialized in unconventional confinement spaces. They spoke carefully, aware that speculation could outrun facts. Still, patterns emerged. Similarities to other hidden detention rooms, found in unrelated cases across the country. Not identical, but aligned in philosophy. Containment without visibility. Control without oversight. The question shifted from what is this place to who is it for? Forensic analysis could not provide immediate answers. Time had been unkind to trace evidence, and intentional cleaning had done the rest. What remained was implication rather than certainty. But implication can be powerful. News of the room leaked despite efforts to contain it, not through official channels at first, but through whispers. A worker telling a friend. A photo taken from too far away to show detail, but close enough to provoke imagination. Online forums ignited, each user layering theory onto speculation, filling silence with possibility. The city responded with caution. Officials emphasized that the investigation was ongoing, that conclusions would not be rushed, that Las Vegas, like any major city, contained forgotten spaces. This was framed as an anomaly, not a symptom. But even the most carefully worded statements could not fully contain the unease, because people understood instinctively what this meant. A hidden cell does not exist in isolation. It requires access, maintenance, knowledge, silence. Someone had built it. Someone had used it. Someone had ensured it remained undiscovered through years of inspections, renovations, ownership changes. That level of invisibility does not happen by accident. Investigators traced permits and renovation logs, encountering gaps that were technically explainable but emotionally troubling. Paperwork that referenced structural modifications without elaboration. Contractors who no longer existed. Companies dissolved, merged, renamed until accountability became abstract. Each missing document felt intentional. Attention turned to the building's past uses. Interviews were conducted with former employees, security personnel, maintenance workers, anyone who might have had access during its operational years. Memories were vague. People remembered strange layouts, locked areas they were told not to enter, instructions not to ask questions. At the time, no one had thought much of it. That was the most chilling part. Nothing about this space had triggered alarm when it mattered. It had existed comfortably within the culture of quiet compliance the city depended on. In a place where privacy is sacred and discretion rewarded, curiosity often feels inappropriate. As the investigation progressed, one realization became impossible to ignore. The room was not built for spectacle. It wasn't part of a dramatic crime spree or a moment of chaos. It was patient, controlled, designed to operate beneath notice. That suggested a kind of cruelty that did not rely on impulse, but on planning, on confidence that no one would look too closely. When the surviving three were briefed more fully, the emotional impact was immediate and devastating. Each detail landed differently, filtered through years of unresolved grief and guilt. They listened in silence, absorbing descriptions that felt both foreign and horrifyingly plausible. They asked the same question in different ways. Could this have been where they were taken? No one answered directly. Authorities avoided confirmation, careful not to overstep evidence. But they did not dismiss the connection either. The timeline overlapped. The proximity matched. The nature of the disappearance aligned uncomfortably well with what the room suggested. The truth hovered just out of reach. What made the space unbearable was not only what might have happened inside it, but how ordinary its concealment had been. This was not a hidden bunker in the desert, not a remote cabin. It was embedded in the infrastructure of a major city, within walking distance of crowds and cameras and constant activity. Someone could have been held there while the strip pulsed with life just blocks away. That thought lingered heavily. The room became a symbol of all the assumptions people make about safety, visibility, and modern oversight, of the belief that darkness only exists on the margins, far from where people gather and celebrate. Las Vegas shattered that illusion effortlessly. As the investigation continued, officials faced mounting pressure to explain how such a space could exist undetected for so long. Explanations came, but they felt insufficient. Budget constraints, oversight limitations, jurisdictional complexity. All true, all hollow, because none of them addressed the deeper truth, that the city's obsession with reinvention had created ideal conditions for erasure, that when buildings are constantly being torn down and rebuilt, the past doesn't just disappear, it gets sealed behind new walls. The hidden room was no longer just a potential crime scene. It was an indictment of a system that prioritized spectacle over scrutiny, of a culture that valued silence as professionalism, of a city that taught people implicitly not to ask what happens behind closed doors. As night fell over the demolition site, the lights from nearby casinos flickered on, painting the horizon with familiar colors. Tourists passed by, unaware that anything unusual had been uncovered. Laughter echoed, music drifted through the air. The city looked the same as it always had. But for those who knew about the room, that normalcy felt fragile, performative, like a mask that had slipped just long enough to reveal what lay beneath. The cell did not scream its story. It didn't need to. Its existence alone was enough to ensure that Christmas night, years earlier, would never be remembered the same way again. Not urgent in tone, not dramatic in language, but heavy with implication. Each of the three heard the same careful phrasing delivered by different voices, as if distance alone might soften its impact. Authorities explained that the discovery was still under investigation, that no conclusions had been reached, that they were contacting individuals connected to older missing persons cases whose timelines overlapped. But none of that mattered. They understood immediately why they were being contacted. For years, the disappearance had existed in a kind of limbo, acknowledged but rarely revisited, open but inactive. Now it had been pulled violently back into the present. The past they had learned to live around was demanding attention again, and this time it wasn't willing to be ignored. Their reactions were not the same. One felt a sudden physical nausea, as if the body had known long before the mind could articulate it. Another felt a sharp, unwelcome surge of relief, followed immediately by guilt for feeling it at all. The third went quiet, retreating inward, bracing for a reality they had never truly stopped imagining. They were asked to return to Las Vegas. Not required. Not yet, but encouraged. The city they had avoided for years was no longer just a place on a map. It was now the center of a possible explanation. The idea of going back felt wrong, almost disloyal, as if stepping into Vegas again might rewrite something they had already failed to protect. Still, they went. Walking through the airport brought back memories they hadn't consciously recalled in years. The smell of recycled air, the echo of announcements, the strange emotional neutrality of transit spaces where everyone is both arriving and leaving at once. They moved through it separately, but each carried the same weight. When they landed, Las Vegas greeted them with its usual confidence. Nothing about the city acknowledged what had been uncovered. The lights were brighter than memory allowed. The strip was louder, newer, reshaped by years of reinvention. Only they felt the difference. Meeting with investigators was surreal. The conversation took place in neutral rooms with blank walls and carefully arranged chairs. No windows, no distractions, just voices and facts and long pauses where emotion threatened to break through. They were shown photographs, not graphic, not sensational, but detailed enough to leave no doubt about the nature of the space that had been found. The walls, the door, the absence of windows. The investigators spoke calmly, explaining what could and could not be determined. They emphasized uncertainty. There was no definitive proof that the missing person had been held there, no forensic evidence tying them directly to the room. But the alignment was troubling enough that the case had been reopened with renewed priority. Each detail landed differently. The one who had organized the trip fixated on logistics, timelines, distances, how close the building was to where they'd been that night. They replayed movements, routes, decisions, calculating how easily someone could have been diverted without raising alarm. The one who had carried grief into Vegas felt it rise again, heavier than before. The idea that the city might have taken more than it had already stolen was unbearable. They struggled to listen without imagining, without filling silence with possibility. The third, who had always been quiet, listened without interruption. But inside, something shifted. Old instincts resurfaced. The sense that there had been more happening that night than anyone acknowledged, that silence had been mistaken for absence. When the meeting ended, no one felt closer to resolution. They stepped back into the city together for the first time since that Christmas, walking streets that felt both familiar and alien. The strip pulsed around them, indifferent to their presence. Tourists laughed, posed for photos, made memories they assumed would remain harmless. The contrast was jarring. They visited the area near the demolished building, though access was restricted. From a distance, it looked unremarkable. Just another construction site, another gap waiting to be filled with something newer, shinier. There was no marker, no indication that anything significant had ever existed there. That absence hurt more than they expected. Standing there, they were forced to confront a truth they had avoided for years, that the city had never marked a loss, had never paused, had never acknowledged that something had gone missing beyond its ability to replace. Media attention followed quickly. The discovery of the hidden room had crossed a threshold, moving from quiet reporting to national interest. True crime podcasts revisited old episodes. Online communities dissected timelines with renewed intensity. Names that had once been footnotes were now spoken again, carefully, tentatively, including theirs. They watched from a distance as strangers speculated about their actions, their motives, their relationships. Some theories were sympathetic, others were not. The internet has little patience for ambiguity, and even less compassion for those who cannot provide answers. Being reinserted into the narrative was exhausting. They were interviewed again and again, each retelling of the story wearing down what little certainty remained. The night fractured further with every recounting. What once felt solid now felt unstable, like a memory viewed through warped glass. And yet, something else happened too. The missing person stopped being abstract. For years, they had existed primarily as absence, a space left behind, a question without form. Now, through investigation and attention, they began to reemerge as a person again, not just someone who vanished, but someone whose life had been interrupted. Family members were contacted, Some had never fully given up hope. Others had quietly prepared themselves for the possibility that answers would never come. The discovery reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar. But it also offered something rare: recognition. The city that had once dismissed the disappearance as unremarkable was now being forced to look at it again, to admit that what had happened mattered, that someone had been lost in a way that deserved scrutiny. Investigators followed new leads aggressively. Old ones were re-examined. Patterns were compared. Other disappearances were revisited with fresh eyes. The hidden room became a lens through which past assumptions were questioned. Why had so many cases been written off so quickly? Why had the absence of immediate evidence been treated as evidence of absence? These questions did not sit comfortably. For the three, the emotional toll was immense. Every day brought new information, new speculation, new reminders of what they had lost. Sleep became fragmented. Anxiety resurfaced with familiar intensity. The coping mechanisms they had built over years of avoidance proved fragile under this renewed pressure. They leaned on each other again, cautiously. Old resentments lingered, but they were softened by shared grief. The disappearance had once fractured their connection. Now, the possibility of truth, however painful, was drawing them back together. Still, certainty remained elusive. Investigators were careful not to promise closure. They spoke in probabilities, not conclusions. The room suggested confinement, but not duration. It suggested intent, but not identity. It suggested suffering, but not outcome. The lack of finality was agonizing. And yet, even without answers, something fundamental had shifted. The disappearance was no longer invisible. It had a context, a location, a physical space that refused to be explained away. The city could no longer pretend that nothing had happened simply because it had not been witnessed. As weeks turned into months, the media cycle began to slow. New stories replaced old ones. Attention drifted, as it always does. But this time, something remained. The room had changed the narrative. It ensured that the disappearance would not be quietly forgotten again, that it would exist as part of the city's hidden history, a reminder of what happens when silence is mistaken for safety. For the three, the question was no longer whether they would ever know exactly what happened. It was whether knowing would be enough to undo the years of not knowing. Standing once more beneath the lights of Las Vegas, they understood something they hadn't before. The city hadn't just taken someone from them. It had taught them how easily absence could be normalized. And now, finally, it was being forced to answer for that lesson. That distinction became clearer as the investigation stretched on, moving not toward resolution, but toward a widening field of unanswered questions. The cell, because by now no one pretended it was anything else, refused to confess. It existed as evidence of intent, not outcome, of preparation, not conclusion. And in that gap between what could be proven and what could only be imagined, the mind began to do dangerous work. Authorities were careful with language. They spoke in conditional terms, emphasizing that while the space was clearly designed for confinement, there was no definitive proof of who had been held there, when, or for how long. No remains had been found. No DNA that could withstand scrutiny. No single artifact that could anchor the room to one person with certainty. For some, that restraint felt responsible. For others, it felt like a continuation of the same silence that had allowed the disappearance to fade in the first place. The public, however, did not share the same caution. Speculation filled the vacuum left by uncertainty. Online, the room became a canvas for theory. Some imagined elaborate criminal networks operating unnoticed beneath the strip. Others focused on lone actors, employees, owners, security staff, people who had had both access and opportunity. Timelines were overlaid. Maps were drawn. Old photos resurfaced and were scrutinized frame by frame. Every interpretation claimed logic. None could claim certainty. What made the room so powerful was not what revealed, but how much it destabilized assumptions. It forced people to reconsider the idea that modern cities are inherently observable, that cameras and crowds and constant movement create safety by default. The cell suggested the opposite, that invisibility can thrive in abundance, that anonymity is not a flaw in the system, but one of its core features. Las Vegas, more than most cities, is built on that principle. Here, people come to shed identity, to become temporary, to exist without consequence. That ethos, celebrated as freedom, also creates space for exploitation. The room was not an anomaly born of chaos. It was a byproduct of design. This realization unsettled even seasoned investigators. They acknowledged privately that the room could not have functioned without silence, not just a physical soundproofing, but social silence. A network of people who didn't ask questions, who followed instructions, who accepted locked doors as normal, who understood that discretion was rewarded. That kind of silence is difficult to break after the fact. As leads were followed and exhausted, the case began to fracture into possibilities rather than progress. Each theory explained part of the story, but none explained all of it. And the more time passed, the more apparent it became that some answers might never surface. For the three who had lived with the disappearance for years, this ambiguity was its own punishment. They had imagined closure as something clean, a revelation, a moment where uncertainty collapsed into understanding. What they were confronting instead was a Messier reality, one where truth existed in fragments, where knowing more did not necessarily mean knowing enough. They wrestled with imagination. Was it better to believe the missing person had been held there briefly, or for a long time? To imagine resistance or resignation? To picture survival? Or to accept that the outcome might have been final long before discovery? Each possibility carried its own weight. Each demanded emotional payment. They found themselves longing, at times, for a definitive answer, no matter how painful, simply to end the cycle of imagining. But certainty did not arrive. And as weeks turned into months, the room began to recede from public conversation, replaced by newer mysteries, fresher outrages. The city resumed its performance. Construction continued. New structures rose where the old building had stood. The physical space where the cell had existed was absorbed back into the city's endless cycle of reinvention. There would be no plaque, no marker, no public acknowledgement beyond archive reports and fading headlines. This, too, felt intentional. What remained was narrative. The cell became a symbol rather than a site. A reminder invoked in discussions about oversight, about missing persons, about the dangers of assuming safety in crowds. It entered the cultural bloodstream, not as a solved case, but as a cautionary tale. For the three, that symbolic weight was difficult to reconcile with their personal loss. They had wanted answers about a person, not lessons about a city. In quiet moments, they revisited the night again, not obsessively now, but reflectively. They acknowledged truths they had avoided before, that they had trusted the city to hold them safely, that they had mistaken familiarity for understanding, that they had underestimated how easy it is for one person to slip away when everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. These realizations did not absolve them of guilt, but they reshaped it. The blame they had carried for years, sharp, personal, isolating, softened into something broader and more complex. Responsibility, they began to understand, was shared among systems as much as individuals, among design choices, cultural norms, and the quiet agreements people make to mind their own business. That understanding did not bring peace, but it brought clarity. The cell did not need to speak to tell its story. Its existence alone suggested a truth that felt increasingly difficult to ignore, that some harm does not rely on chaos, but on order, on planning, on the confidence that no one will look too closely. That realization haunted the city more than any single unsolved disappearance ever could, because if the room could exist unnoticed for years, then it was not unique. It was merely the one that had been found. As the investigation slowed and official updates became infrequent, the three were left with a choice they had not anticipated, whether to continue waiting for answers that might never come, or to decide what meaning, if any, they would assign to what they now knew. They did not choose the same path. One became an advocate, speaking publicly about missing adults, about how easily cases are dismissed when there is no immediate evidence of violence. They channeled grief into action, believing that awareness could prevent future disappearances from being swallowed by indifference. Another withdrew again, but differently this time, not out of denial, but out of acceptance. They stopped searching for explanations and focused instead on preserving memory, on ensuring that the missing person was remembered not for how they vanished, but for how they lived. The third remained conflicted, suspended between those approaches. They continued to follow updates, to read reports, to imagine outcomes. For them, uncertainty had become a familiar companion, uncomfortable but survivable. What united them was an understanding they had not shared before. Closure is not something that arrives intact. Sometimes, it must be assembled from fragments, facts, implications, emotions, and unanswered questions, arranged carefully enough to allow life to continue without pretending the loss never happened. The room did not give them closure. It gave them permission to stop blaming themselves for not having it. And in a city built on illusion, that may have been the most honest truth they would ever receive. That is when the city becomes what it wants to be, when imperfections dissolve into light and motion, when distance hides detail, when everything feels intentional. From far away, the Strip is a single glowing organism, pulsing steadily against the dark desert. It gives the impression of permanence, of control, of something carefully maintained. Up close, it is harder to hold on to that illusion. Years after the discovery, most people walking those streets have no idea what was found just beyond a neon radius. They don't know about the building that no longer exists, the room that was never meant to be seen, the questions that were raised and then quietly set aside. There is nothing to tell them. No marker, no warning, no trace that would interrupt the fantasy. That absence feels deliberate. Cities, like people, choose which memories to keep visible. Las Vegas has always preferred reinvention to reflection. It buries the past not out of malice, but out of efficiency. What can't be monetized is removed. What can't be explained is replaced. And what threatens the illusion is softened until it loses its edges. The cell did not fit the story the city tells about itself, so it was absorbed, reframed, and eventually allowed to fade. Construction crews finished their work. A new structure rose where the old one had stood, gleaming and modern, designed to suggest safety and luxury. Tourists passed through without hesitation, trusting that anything built so recently must be secure, must be regulated, must be harmless. Trust comes easily in a place designed to encourage it. For the three, returning to ordinary life after everything that had surfaced was disorienting. They carried knowledge that felt incompatible with the world around them. Conversations moved on. Headlines shifted. People forgot. But they could not unsee what had been revealed. Not just about the disappearance, but about how easily it had been erased. They noticed things differently now. Locked doors without explanation. Restricted areas dismissed as private property. The way people avoid asking questions when answers might be inconvenient. The way silence is often mistaken for professionalism and compliance for safety. They understood, in a way they hadn't before, that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it hides behind policy, behind procedure, behind the assumption that someone else has already checked. Las Vegas had taught them that lesson brutally. The missing person remained officially unresolved. No final declaration. No confirmation that could settle the matter definitively. In the eyes of the law, the case existed as a collection of facts and uncertainties, archived but not closed. In the lives of those who loved them, the story was different. They spoke of them carefully now, deliberately, not as someone who vanished mysteriously, but as someone who had been real, who had laughed, argued, hoped, and stood beneath Christmas lights believing the night was harmless. Memory became an act of resistance against erasure. Every year, when December returned, the city dressed itself in familiar colors again, red and gold, artificial snow, holiday music echoing through spaces designed to keep people moving. New photographs were taken in the same places the old one had been captured years earlier. Smiling faces, bright lights, the promise of escape. Somewhere in that cycle, the past lingered, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to remind those who knew that the city's glow was not proof of safety, only of intention. That celebration can coexist with suffering without either acknowledging the other. The cell had revealed something uncomfortable but essential, that darkness does not always exist in opposition to light. Sometimes it survives because of it, because lights distract, because crowds diffuse responsibility, because movement convinces people that nothing is static long enough for harm to take root. And yet, it does. The story never received the ending people expect from stories like this. There was no final confession, no clear villain unmasked, no moment where everything snapped into focus and made sense. That absence frustrated some, angered others. But for those closest to it, the lack of neat resolution felt honest. Not all losses can be explained. Not all truths can be recovered. And not all systems are built to protect the people who move through them quietly. Las Vegas continues to thrive. It welcomes millions each year, offering the same promises it always has. Anonymity, indulgence, reinvention. Most visitors leave with nothing more than memories and photos. Some leave lighter than they arrived. Some leave changed in ways they can't articulate. And some, rarely, do not leave at all. The city does not pause for them. It never has. That may be the most haunting part. Not the existence of a hidden cell, not the years of unanswered questions, not even the possibility of what happened within those walls, but the ease with which it all folded back into normalcy, the speed with which absence was smoothed over by new construction and brighter lights, as if the city itself had learned how to forget. And perhaps that is the final truth this story leaves behind. That places built on distraction are uniquely capable of concealment. That danger does not always look like chaos. That sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not defined by what we discover, but by what we choose not to keep looking for. On the Strip, the lights glow on. Somewhere a camera flashes, and another photograph is taken, beautiful, ordinary, and unaware of the weight it might one day be asked to carry. Developer mode.